Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first episode of the third season of Open Source in Business. I'm joined by Laura Walker McDonald. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, and we met about 10 years ago in France, in Paris, when I was coordinating a humanitarian free and open source software track at an event there. And at the time, you were working on FrontlineSMS, and you actually keynoted that event for us, which was pretty awesome. And I mean, I remember that keynote so clearly of you standing up there and presenting. You know, we're made aware of crises, we give to crises, but look at this. There's 3/4 of the map that involves development, recovery, and so like I remember that particular presentation so well. What have you been doing since working on Frontline?
Do you know, I hadn't thought of that graphic for years, but it is a really excellent wheel that shows the disaster response cycle, doesn't it? And the response bit is this tiny wedge at the top, and the rest of it is everything you have to do to recover and prepare. Yeah. I'll have to dig that out.
Still have people in Puerto Rico without running water, for example, 2 years after the hurricane.
Yes. And maybe we can come back to why that's relevant to technology. But yes, so what have I been doing since? So we ran Frontline as a kind of nonprofit, So we had some grant funding that was to do with, we were through our initial innovation window. We had some grant funding that was to do with thematic areas. And then we had started to build a product-based business with a cloud version of the platform. And ultimately, we felt that the grant-based funding was not going to be a sustainable thing for us. So we packaged up the software, and there was a kind of management buyout. And my husband now, Sean McDonald, bought Frontline. We spun it out into a for-profit company, which he's run ever since, and it's 100% coded in Kenya. And as some of the folks that I might know, they've actually made the difficult decision to transition that to be a sort of fully open source project that still exists and the code is still out there, but that they're no longer actively supporting, and they're closing down the business. So there are a couple of blog posts that he's published that are out there about that now. But while he was setting that up as a for-profit, we kept the 501c3, which is a non-profit in the US, and we ran that as SIMLab. And that was a non-profit sort of think tank and consultancy. Some grants, but mostly, you know, people would come to us if they wanted to think about how to run projects using inclusive technology. So we did no apps, none of that. It was more about, we need to reach or work with this population. And they typically, like most people in the world, don't have great data access or devices and so on. How do we do that? And so we would consult on those things. And that ended inelegantly at the end of 2017 due to an unfortunate series of events, which I wrote a couple of blog posts about as well. And then since then, I sort of concluded that I tried building software, and that was really hard because I felt people didn't really know how to implement it properly. So then I tried sort of doing more technical guidance, like at SIMLab, like how do you implement properly? And that didn't really help either, because it turns out people aren't funded to do it properly. So I thought, okay, I've got to go in at the system level and try and change the money. So I worked on that first at the Global Alliance for Humanitarian Innovation, GAHI, which has since shut down. Unfortunately, it was a World Humanitarian Summit outcome that did not get renewed. And then I joined Dial, where I am now, at the end of early 2019. And actually, you're speaking to me 1 week before my last day. So I'll be leaving Dial and moving on to the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as a digital and data advisor in their Washington delegation. So I should say at the top that this may come out around the time that I actually join the ICRC, and my views are my views here and do not represent the views of the ICRC when I'm speaking today.
Very clear. Thank you. And actually, the two blog posts that you mentioned around the closure of SIMLab were one of the things that really inspired me that you've done in recent years, because I find that, you know, we're so quick to celebrate success, and yet we don't really take the effort to learn the lessons from failure. And I thought your blog posts were very insightful and reflective and introspective, and you know, I really appreciated the thought that you put into them. I hope we can talk about them today.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate that. And it's funny because, you know, it was actually 4 years ago to around now that I was writing them. And it was this awful time where we hadn't quite announced yet that this was happening, but we knew it was happening. And we had already, I think, really reduced the team, and were wrapping up programs and things. And really, we had always been about sort of transparent learning. So we tried to publish everything that we knew. Like if we thought of something or did something for a project, we would try and put a version of that up, and then make it all Creative Commons. And I just thought, if we have to go through this, at least other people can learn from it. And I also felt like, I have nothing to lose here. The worst has happened. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen if I share what really, I didn't share the whole everything, but gave a sense of what happened. Then at least other people, maybe I can say that on behalf of other people who, I think most people, very few things just close. Things like, get bought in by other people, or leadership changes. So the thing is still existing, and you can't really speak publicly about your experiences because you can't hurt the organization, or, and really, truly, this should have been the case with me, but you don't want to burn your bridges because you still got to work in this space. So I just felt like, if this awful thing has to happen, and it's felt very unfair, then at least I could share what I thought had happened and some of the challenges around it. And the funny thing is, it seems to have been really helpful for people. And I've had lots of people tell me over the years that they found it insightful or useful. And especially at the time, lots of people actually called me, like old school, on the phone to tell me that they were going through that too, and thank you, which meant a lot. That was really nice to hear.
So you mentioned FrontlineSMS. Can you give a brief description of like what it was, what it is, and why it's so important to the humanitarian sector?
Sure, or maybe why I think it ought to be.
Well, I think it is. I mean, I really do. I like FrontlineSMS was one of those projects that back when I was doing this track for the 2 or 3 years I did it, everybody was depending on it, because things like OpenMRS, for example, they needed some way to send SMSs and get SMSs from regional clinics. Sahana and Ushahidi both had FrontlineSMS as part of their infrastructure, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
So
yeah,
it's really been a key dependency for a lot of the projects in this space. And I wonder if you can, talk a little bit about the project's inception and how it grew and why it was important.
Sure. Well, I should say at this point that the founder and creator of FrontlineSMS was actually Ken Banks, who I'm sure that you know. And he had been traveling and working in sub-Saharan Africa, and had concluded that there was immense potential in text messaging, but it was kind of locked up in commercial companies. You couldn't easily send and receive text messages as a community group or something. So people kind of forget now what it was then to send a text message, but you couldn't text more than one person at a time. And if you received text messages, they would be on your phone, and you'd have limited capacity. I don't know if anyone else remembers going in and deleting the text from your phone. Now imagine you have M-Pesa notifications, M-Pesa being the digital financing tool in Kenya that uses primarily SMS. So as back then, 2005, 2008, really text messaging was something that could be really powerful, but was quite hard to use at the sort of local level. And so he thought, well, if you could write a simple piece of software like Outlook for SMS that would sit on your laptop, and then you could plug in a modem or a phone and have the laptop talk to it, then you could manage text messages just like they were email, and you could have groups, and you could automate things, and you could do all sorts of clever stuff. So he wrote the prototype, I believe, on a kitchen table somewhere. And then he managed to get sort of innovation funding for it, and built up a community. And the first big moment was the Nigerian elections in 2008. We got some big coverage and lots of users. The Nigerian Election Commission were using it to help monitor the election. And so it wasn't only sort of local last mile clinics where nothing else worked. It was also national bodies were saying, like, look, I just don't have a good solution.
Was that the Nigerian election that led to the creation of Ushahidi?
That was the unrest after the election in 2008. So I may have missed that. Maybe Nigeria was 2007. But to 2008 was Ushahidi in Kenya and the post-election violence there. And of course, Ushahidi are still going from strength to strength. And recently they did get some really fantastic funding from a big beneficiary. So that was really good to see. But yes, so at that time, there just weren't that many opportunities. There were one or two other products. Rapid SMS, of course, is the other one that was around at the same time that did almost the same thing. But you had to be a developer and you had to run it on your own server and all that. And Frontline really was a plug and play, sort of out of the box laptop thing. People did run it on servers. You could do a lot if you knew about coding, but if you didn't, you could still figure it out. So I joined in 2010 to help write user support documentation, provide user support, talk about it, run the website, all that stuff. And Ken was actually ready to go and invent the next thing. So after a while, I sort of ended up helping to run it, and then eventually became co-CEO with Sean, my husband, in 2012. So I really spent years where the first thing I would do in a day was check the user support forums, which were on Ning. And we had a within 24 hours you get an answer rule, so which Ken started. He used to do it, and then I did it, and then we had other folks do it. And one of the chief problems that we had was that, and again, people maybe forget that there was a world before Twilio, which is one of the big SMS aggregator machines. If you get text messages when you order takeaway, it's probably them or someone like them who's interfaced with the company's text message API and is receiving messages and sending them out. Those things did not exist so much in those days. And so something like FrontlineSMS was a good option. But many people were still using phones and modems. And I have some in the house. I should have brought one to wave at you, but they look like just little USB memory sticks, but they're actually phone
you could even
modems.
use like the bricks, the unbreakable Nokia 5500 phones.
Exactly. So, yeah. Yes, that's right. There were some. We had lists of phones that had proven to work. But the thing is that if you're hooking a SIM card up to a machine, actually already breaking the terms of service of the SIM card, and you're hacking a device that does not want to do what you're trying to get it to do.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time telling people to try turning it off and on again, because that genuinely was a good way to try and fix it. Or I had a list as long as your arm of the things that we would say, well, okay, try going and seeing if this process is running and shut it down and just, open everything up, start it later. Try opening the modem driver and then closing it and then open Frontline. We had all these tips and tricks. And eventually we just thought, you know what, this isn't sustainable, because the mobile market in many ways is what will happen if the internet does not remain neutral. There's no one way to do messaging in mobile. Every mobile network is its own fiefdom. They have different rules about whether messages travel between networks and across borders, different pricing, different this and that. And then devices are the same. So you might even Android phones run different versions of Android depending on the manufacturer of the phone, because they all have different things they need, bells and whistles that they need to have drivers for. And so if you're building software, even an app, but especially if you're building software that's actually using the hardware, then you've just got this infinite array of edge cases to build for. And so it just worked less and less well.
Okay.
So we decided that we needed to be able to provide that edge case if people wanted it, but also scale and provide something that was easier. So we put it in the cloud and hooked it into SMS and messaging providers like Twilio using APIs. So now you're sending your messages through the internet. But we also built an Android app called Frontline Sync that let you hook up to an Android phone and send more messages. And you pairing with the phone locally and sending it across the internet using the phone. So different approaches that we tried. And when I left, or when we packaged it up and rolled and spun it out as a for-profit, that was where we got to with the product set. And since then, I would let them talk about it. But since then, they've really focused on making it a messaging engine. So they realized the real power of SMS is its immediacy, the way you can have complex conversations with people. And they focused on building sort of conversation engines that could be really powerful and get people through intricate processes using text messaging, and did build some really interesting recipe builders and interfaces to make that happen.
So I'm just curious, did you have any issue with regulators around the way that you were using SMSs and breaking terms of service back in the day?
I think that we were too small, and I think the instances that we were running were too small, but definitely there were stories where, activists use Frontline. That's one of the things, is that we never knew about everything everyone was doing with Frontline because we didn't want to. And we actually stopped registering downloads. We always made it possible for you to just fill in a form with fake information and download it and go about your business. And we enabled you. We never did any tracking you couldn't turn off because activists use Frontline. And actually, I know if you talk to the team now, they're working on really some stuff that is designed for use by activists in places where internet shutdowns happen. And certainly there were colleagues who used FrontlineSMS in places where they were sending messages that were critical of a regime. And they would have the phone and the modem or the modem and the computer in the back of a truck and be driving around so that the location couldn't be triangulated, but they would still get shut down. And then they just get another SIM card, try again.
Okay. So what was the financial model for FrontlineSMS and then for SIMLab afterwards? We've mentioned you've mentioned grants, so there were some grants for Frontline, but did you have a commercial model as well? Were you selling something?
Yeah, and I think this is interesting. So we've tried at Dial, my current role, we are the stewards of the principles for digital development. One of the principles is build for sustainability, and we have a toolkit that we're developing, which should be out in early 2022, built based on the business model canvas for building sustainable business models in the specific context of the humanitarian development space. Doesn't have to be software, it could be also a service-based business, but so I've been thinking about all these options that you have and observing also what friends did. So with Frontline, when I got there, we had 3 or 4 core innovation grants. So they were restricted, but they were for the core business of what we were doing, building the software for the first time, maintaining the website, paying salaries, that kind of thing, not for anything new over and above. And that just started to run dry. And they, even donors who thought we were good would come back and say, yes, but what else am I getting? I don't want just more of the same. I want something new. So we would say, okay, we'll build a new version of Frontline with a new look and feel that's designed explicitly for people who are zoologists. That's not a real example, but we want you to build this thing that's special for this sector. And so we would think, okay, well, actually that requires very superficial changes to the UI. So we'll be able to do that and still invest in the core functionality. And each of those sectors would enable us to add a particular thing. So I think there were, trying to think which sector it was now, but there was one that enabled us to build in scheduling. I think it may have been radio, for example, with scheduled messages. And we hadn't been able to fund that functionality before. So we said, look, this is particularly useful in media because, and then we achieved funding for that. And that was very helpful for a while to be able to say, here's the core, you can add to it. Here's the layer we're going to build for you. Okay. But it's still restricted. It's still, you have to build that particular thing. You have to then build into a new market, new theme, a new niche. So that worked for a while. And then after a while, we had 4 or 5 of these. So we're now maintaining 4 or 5 different feature sets and skins and whatnot. So then we kind of rationalized and brought it all back together and said, we're not going to do any new skins. We will do new features, but it'll be part of Frontline, but it will be especially useful for a particular sector. But we just started to feel like there are limits to how often you can do that. And, when you go back and say, well, look, actually, I'm not done. I've built this first version. We've learned some stuff. We want to make it better. We also need to update a lot of things about the software now. The UI needs a look, and we have to pay our accountant. That's not a strong argument. And actually, my colleagues at the Open Source Center at the Digital Impact Alliance at Dial, where I work now, talk about the sort of sustainability valley of death, where you go through this bit where you're not scalable yet, but you can't get that critical funding to build your core business, to strengthen your product, to make that leap essentially. And so we investigated a bunch of different options. We looked at investment for a long time. And that was part of the ethos behind spinning out as a for-profit was, well, we need to get it out of a 501c3 so that it's a better investment proposition. But what our research turned up was look, you're going to have real return possibility for or exit potential for an investor to really look at you seriously. So we didn't turn out to be that viable as an investment proposition. And we felt that it wasn't the best thing to put our energy into. And so then what ultimately Frontline became, I think they had some grants still around features for use cases like the internet shutdown use case, but mainly they would have users who would come to them and say, look, we really want to use Frontline for this project, but it doesn't do this thing. So can you be consultants for us and help us do this project? And in so doing, also build this thing that it needs to do that it doesn't yet do.
Right.
And that ended up being, we also had a product-based revenue model even before we spun it out. So during my time, but that never really outweighed the amount of, say, a UN agency coming to you and saying, we have a big instance in a country, we want you to help us run it and also build this extra bit that we need. And that sort of scale, especially if you can keep your operation very light, which it was. I had a small group of developers based in Kenya, very few staff elsewhere doing fundraising and marketing. Then you can keep going in that way. But it limited the size of the operation. I mean, they weren't ever planning. I won't speak too much about this. I think you should ask them, but not planning for growth really, just trying to keep going and keep a good product and keep the integrity and the leadership and the ethical decision making in-house really.
Yeah, and I've been on a couple of boards of humanitarian organizations and in software, and that's a common story, right? It's you don't want to get into your business model being pay for features, because people pay once and they don't expect to have to pay again once you've developed the feature for them. And but the consulting business model is inherently hours, right? It's person hours. It's an hour by hour, day by day business. So you end up basically not having that much margin left over to develop your core product, right? Or pay for everything else that goes with it, whether it's business development or even marketing and growing awareness around the project, or community management, all of the things that come along with running a successful open source project. Did you end up having a reseller market for FrontlineSMS? Was that something that ever developed, or did that not make sense in the context of Frontline?
No, I mean, that and white labeling were things that we looked at, but that never wound up being something that we thought about really. And I think there are a few interesting challenges that that kind of hamper some of this as well, which is it's hard to find generalist funders who will fund something that does anything. And similarly, being able to make your product attractive as like a core product, if it also is trying to work for many other people. We always made the case that you could actually change all the terminology in the front end. So if people said they needed to change a certain term from nurses to teachers, that they could do that. But we always faced a little bit of opposition, and some other organizations have, and maybe this would have been the cannier move, gone deep on one thematic area like health, and really go and build for a health use cases very emphatically and help really build a brand in health, and then branch out to other areas of work. And we always resisted doing that because there was always so much interest from other areas. So that sort of limits where you can look also for funding. And this also is something that Dial talks about as well, is that it's really important to build cross-cutting, sustainable digital global goods that work across sectors. And this overinvestment in sector silos means that when you then don't have say, if you have digital ID or records management or something, we have loads of that in health, loads of options. If you go and look at like agriculture, there are still lots. If you go and look at education, there are fewer. If you go and look at the law, there's almost nothing. And yet all of those things have been built before. They just have different names on them and they're marketed differently. So if you can make them more cross-cutting, then we can all collectively spend better money because we're coordinating and consolidating our investment in, let's have a good digital ID provider, let's have a good digital payments set of solutions, and let's do things like even appointment scheduling and contact management. All these things are fairly boring building blocks. And so I do think there is increasing acceptance of that at a system level. So you're seeing lots of initiatives and policy commitments to that as a message that is now understood. I mean, at the sort of senior technical levels within places like the Foreign and the FCDO in the UK or USAID, people really understand this, that it is better to do it that way. Whether they can get it done that way is a different thing. But you're seeing things like the UN Secretary General's digital roadmap from 2020 recommended investment in open source digital public goods and set up or promote, as part of the follow-up to that, UNICEF and ITU and others have set up the Digital Public Goods Alliance to help bring together actors to promote digital public goods, and Dial's part of that as well.
Okay.
Part of that effort. And
but
then,
I guess if your model is around grant funding or benefactors, like having rich benefactors who do this as part of charitable giving, is they're more likely to give around a mission, whether that mission is education,
exactly,
or water or literacy or healthcare or whatever it is. And like sending and receiving SMSs is not necessarily sexy.
right.
Or digital archival software or whatever it is.
Exactly. And you also, it's silly things like the photographs. Like, what photograph should I put on my website exactly that isn't extractive and kind of ridiculous? You're just building really good software that does this for a very difficult environment.
Right.
But how do you really, anyway, so that was definitely a challenge we had. And I think the software solutions that exist, that have been so sort of starved of this core sustainability and, basic functionality improvement, things like also what the Open Source Center calls the dirty jobs, the governance structure and the developer docs and, making sure that the libraries and all the licensing is up to date and all of that stuff. These are critical things that let you be an acceptable thing for someone like a government or a UN agency to procure, which is when it gets to be sustainable, right? Is when someone is procuring you or they are contributing theirs or someone else's time to making your project work. But where the challenge that I see there is that making that jump from philanthropists or small beers, relatively small beer in software terms, funding from foundations or wherever it's coming from, to maintain an open source project that's really still a labor of love, when the primary movers, like I mentioned, the Digital Public Goods Alliance, another one is GovStack, which is Estonia and ITU again, and Dial, and a number of other countries working together to help demonstrate how you would use reusable digital public good building blocks to build a whole of government tech stack that would help you deliver services as a government in lots of different sectors. But this is government level. Like, that's such a huge sea change in terms of what your software has to be able to handle, and making that investment from A to B is very big. And I'm not sure if a government looks at a piece of software and says, well, this has potential, but it definitely needs work before it's going to be able to do what we need it to do. Are they really going to turn around and then make sure that happens? Or are we going to, it's more likely that you're going to say, look, this piece of software has potential. We hazard that it might be useful at this level. So we could maybe fundraise or come together to fund that, but then making sure that you get user feedback and you're building something that's really going to work, and you've got a real end client in mind and in the mix who's like genuinely going to use this thing when it's done. There are just these are all coordination problems. And I see it as a real challenge in an increasingly nationalist again world, and where public commons is becoming less and less common. We're actually saying, no, in order to get this done, we all have to reinvest in a global digital public commons of goods that we're all investing in because we have confidence that we will need them, and working together to make them better. That seems to me to be a tall order.
Just in case for anybody who's wondering what the background noise is, if there are background, I don't know if you can hear, but I have a delivery coming in, so there's a truck outside right now. But we'll keep going. We'll soldier on, and we'll hope that the audio quality is good enough. You mentioned procurement, and I think that's one of the key differences that hits humanitarian projects in particular, is when you want to be procured by a government, you have all sorts of compliance issues. You have procurement rules on what vendors can be used for software procurement. Is that like an insurmountable barrier to open source adoption in this space, or is it just something that we need to help governments evolve their thinking in? Because one of the things that I've noticed is public money spent on open source tends to be spent, as far as I can tell, either through vendors that have already established themselves and can get through that procurement process, or through public employees being paid to work on the software, that there's nothing in between. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that, I mean, Dial's Open Source Center has looked a little bit at the case for an open source software foundation for that reason, because you need to have something, a container. Some of these open source projects don't even have an institutional home. They literally just exist in the commons, but that means they can't accept money, or you can't hire someone to work on it. So, you know, I think it can be a big problem, both because if there are institutions, they may not be the kind of institution that can get through a procurement process. Or it might be more that the procurement process itself is not particularly well set up for digital and development, or for digital specifically. So, for example, procurement processes tend to be waterfall. Successful digital implementations are more agile, as we know, sort of more planning up front. Well, not more planning up front, more sort of user work up front, less developing and then testing, more testing as you go, all of that stuff. And so I think there's pieces there. In my mind, there's also some regulatory stuff to be done to make sure that people are testing whether they should be investing in a piece of software, or whether the use case they have in mind is safe and ethical and legal. And all of those resources, those legal frameworks and regulation don't necessarily exist either in all countries. And then open source providers aren't going to be able to fill that gap themselves necessarily.
So I've seen Luis Villa in particular recently has been writing about how the increasing adoption of open source software in the public space and by large enterprise has put an increasing burden of expectations on open source developers who are ill to deal with it. So even if you are a successful project, all of a sudden now you're expected to care about supply chain security, or you know, certifications of your project security processes, or you know, I don't know. I'm trying to think of some other certification, like various ISO certifications of fitness for use for a particular purpose. That open source projects are just not made. Like, that's not by design. A community can't, in some sense, do those things, and yet they're expected to be responsive to requests to do things like that. Do you have a similar problem in general in the NGO space, or is that specifically more for enterprise software?
I think that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think often, and I mean, I will say that Dial's in an odd position here, because we are clearly overtly pro open source and have an open source center that's been working for years on this. And yet at the same time, we have to recognize that currently open source products are not going to be always a valid choice for country governments when they're trying to choose something to administer their payments infrastructure. Right. And so there is a role for the private sector in contributing to open source, yes, but also potentially commercial off the shelf and software as a service implementation. You know, these are things that governments have to reach for. Data storage also, and for that reason, we don't necessarily sign up to definitions of open source that are, you know, really watertight. Like everything must be absolutely open, because we do think the lines blur. But yeah, I wonder if I do think that happens. I think that's why a lot of open source implementations never get out of the pilot phase. They never really scale. And when we get to scaling, there are lots of, you know, teething problems. And you know, there've definitely been some high profile problems where someone's been administering an open source piece of software and haven't quite gotten all the security measures correct. And there is, for example, a test admin user somewhere in there who still has the password it came out of the box with. Right. And so it's a vulnerable instance. Like, that is literally an example that has happened. And then, you know, open source gets the blame for that when actually it's, you know, an administration fail. But it's also the fact that you're probably not resourcing your implementation correctly. And it's symptomatic also of general continued underfunding of digital within governments, within NGOs. We haven't built the digital capacity to know what to look for, to know where the risks are. We don't hire or retain technical talent terribly well within the NGO world. And I think there's we are late to the recognition that technology is here to stay as part of the way we do business. It would be like hiring a senior member of staff who doesn't know how to be diplomatic in a meeting. You also have to be able to look at a tool that you might be using for a purpose and think, I wonder if there is a cybersecurity risk here, and measure and sort of go make sure that your team is covering that off or is resourced to cover that off.
Right.
So I think it's not just about open source. It's also because open source should be all of us. It should be more like, I need to use a thing. Here's a thing that needs some work. I'm going to do that work or resource that work and then give it back to everybody. This is our version of it. And again, I think for me, it's a bit of a mindset shift that is needed away from, there are products and they are or are not good enough and they have different maintenance approaches and I'm going to use them as a customer, to we are all going to need to use stuff. Let's all build this stuff together and have a common pool of them. And I do think that's where the sector is going with the Digital Public Goods Alliance and the GovStack stuff. If there are people out there who are really, really interested in defining what good looks like around open source stacks and architectures, GovStack is the place for you, because they have working groups looking at each and every one of these in different sectors and all these different cross-cutting issues as well. So I really see that as a positive thing, because it also gives donors somewhere to go if they say, I want to fund this, but I don't know how to do it well. Having these new initiatives does help, I think, to direct traffic a bit.
And you mentioned Dial's recommendations or Dial's guidelines on creating sustainable projects. Can you talk through some of the recommendations that you have for people who are in this space on the things that they should be doing?
Mm-hmm. So we have the Open Source Center is one thing, and there, if you go and look at the digitalimpactalliance.org website, there is both the Open Source Center there, and they have, I'm not sure if they have online resources, but definitely have experienced colleagues who have helped many projects talk through some of these issues around sustainability. And now I have to switch headphones because this one's going to die. So let's hope this happens seamlessly. And then also we steward, as I mentioned, the digital principles, and we're working on a Build for Sustainability toolkit now, which I mentioned, which is out in January.
Right.
So this is based on the business model canvas, and so there are building blocks. And if you've ever seen one of these canvases, they're a bit intimidating because there are lots of boxes and you have to fill each one out. Well, for each of them, and there are 10, so for things like, what's your value proposition? Who are your customers? What are your cost drivers? What are your channels for selling? Things like that. You can go into it. Competitors, yeah. You can go in and fill in a series of questions that will help you concoct that one sentence that goes in the box. And then if you're not sure what the answers to the questions are, then even below that level, there are a series of wizards that will help you to answer those questions. Wizards, toolkits, and exercises that you can go through to help you build out this canvas in the areas you need it. If you feel like you know the answer, one of the blocks, you can just fill it in. But it's really intended to try and help think through these issues. And what I think is interesting about it is, and as an entrepreneur at Frontline, we were often sent, it was often a condition of funding that we went through some sort of sustainability bootcamp or a set of resources or mentorship, but they were always based on regular software. So it was,
what's your license fee?
Well, it was end user pays.
Right.
And in development and aid, the end user doesn't pay. They can't pay, or they don't. If they could, you couldn't take their money. So that it's not, the value is not to them, it's to the donor, or it's to the person who is contracting you as a consultant or as a software provider. And so your value proposition is different. And the other thing that's different to me is the cash flow and the fact that you're dealing with either very ponderous procurement processes that might require all sorts of hoops to jump through to try and get your contract written in a certain way. So, try being procured as a software provider who usually charges a monthly fee when the contract requires deliverables. Like, it's that kind of thing. And it can take many, many months. Whole pregnancies can unfold in the course of like trying to get a contract through some of these institutions. And that's no one's fault. That's just how they are. But that means that you could put, 6 months into a proposal process with a potential partner, wait 6 months to hear the result, win, and then spend 9 months in contracting before you even start working. And all of that time you're thinking, who do I need to hire? What do I need to build to make this work?
Right.
But you're not going to see the funding until some indeterminate time around that time, because you have to, maybe it's in arrears. That is an extremely difficult thing to pull off as a small business. And I am very challenged to know exactly what diversified revenue stream is going to protect you from that level of volatility in your cash flow.
Right. So is that kind of lead time of 15 to 18 months from first contact to first invoice typical?
I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, in my experience,
Okay.
it was never less than, I mean, if it was a small bit of consulting, you might get it done in 3 months. I never got a grant in less than 6 months from having the idea, writing the initial proposal, to cash in the bank, starting work. I mean, humanitarian is the exception because emergencies happen, but we can come back to that. But I mean, certainly I had one proposal that we wrote in 2011, and the person to run the program started in 2014.
So how do you manage cash flow in a situation like that? I mean, was that the thing that made it particularly difficult in SIMLab?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely one of the nails in our coffin. There were a few. I definitely think I hung on longer than I should have. I should have admitted that the writing was on the wall. There are moments I look back at and it's like, that would have been a good time. And I think, Sean, all credit to him, took the question to his team. We can do it. We can hang on like this, or we can stop now. What do you want to do? And they made that decision to stop now at a much better time period than I did with SIMLab. Right. But yeah, it was definitely, or it wasn't even that. It was just that I think we didn't correctly understand what the payment schedule was going to be, and neither did anybody else, it seems. So, yeah, that really did catch us out, but I should have had more diverse income streams. But I think things like technology, maybe not now, post-COVID, where if COVID's done anything, it's demonstrated the centrality of digital to us all carrying on, right? But then digital was a nice to have. And so in a recession, all of the nice to have sort of certainly assessments and evaluation around your digital projects would just go away. And if that's your business model, then you've got to think about what you're doing that is not optional for someone, that you won't get cut if there's a budget cut, or they won't decide to bring someone in to do it in-house once the proposal comes through, which happened to us a couple of times.
So if I were to put you back in 2015 and ask you what would you do differently in SIMLab, what would that be?
Well, there's many things I could say about things that happened in 2016, but let's draw a veil over that. Being in the US, in 2015, I think I should have called it earlier than that. We had many programs that were successful in those years, and we did important work. We put together our context assessment and monitoring and evaluation of technology projects toolkits, which are still people talk to me about, especially the M&E one. Now that was good, and we did some really good responsible data work in those years as well. So I'm proud of the work that we did, but I think there were definitely signs of, we've been hearing a lot of donors being interested in building capacity and improving practice in the field of doing better digital technology work, and being very interested in investing in things like the monitoring and evaluation work, or responsible data, and saying, yes, what would you do? What do you want to do? What do you think we need? And that just started to go away. And I think, honestly, 2016, what happened was Trump was elected, and that just signaled, and Brexit, and that signaled big shifts in two important markets for donorship, where everyone started to retrench a bit. And honestly, this kind of best practice thing has not come back until now. And now it's a big preoccupation again. Okay, we're all doing digital, not sure we're doing it well. What do we need to do to improve this? We've got to solve this digital capacity problem. And
with the challenge of vaccinations at an international level for COVID is kind of a classic example of where, we've kind of lost that international cooperation, and now we need to find it again.
That's right. And that's a big theme for the UN General Assembly, which has started now, and the big high-level week is next week. And the Secretary General they've just published their outcome and agenda, and there's not much in there about digital, but if you read between the lines, it's all about multilateralism and cooperation, and the digital commons is definitely part of that, and that's definitely how the Secretary General sees it, and sees the private sector as an important part of that, not just member states, but also the private sector as a really important partner.
So you've talked about some of the things that you would do differently personally in SIMLab, but are there any general lessons for people who are starting a business now? You've mentioned diversify your revenue streams, but you also mentioned that you should have focus and focus on a story that you can tell donors or grantors, foundations, that you're like, you don't want to be too general, but you also want to have multiple revenue streams. Are there any other lessons that you would kind of draw from that time as a CEO?
Yeah, and I'll be candid with you that at the moment I have very little appetite to do that again. It is one of the most singularly stressful things that you can do, is make yourself responsible for other people's paychecks, and I'm still enjoying not doing that. There is such a rush from creation and striking new ground, but it is exceptionally hard, and so solidarity to everybody out there who is even thinking about it, and certainly those who are doing it. So yeah, I believe so much in the mission that I believe the mission needed to be everywhere, and I think you can believe that but also be real about where you're going to be able to change minds. And I think about Amazon as a good example, which is, I think that while there is a certain there's no map, there's no grand roadmap, I do know that Jeff Bezos intended to end up doing more than just books, but felt like books were the good entry point. And so that's where he started. I still have a bookmark somewhere that just says books and CDs on it at the tabs at the top. Imagine that now. And how crazy we all thought it was when they suddenly started selling kitchen roll as well. I don't know if you remember that. Wow, that's weird. I can't imagine buying kitchen roll on Amazon. But there is that thing of find the thing that's going to be comprehensible, necessary, and easy to explain and sell to an audience that you think is ready to pay for it. That would be a good start. And then you can branch out from there. Even if what you're really selling is a way of thinking about the world, start small. So, I mean, maybe what I might do now is something like start from evaluation. So if there are things that we need to do really urgently, we've got to build digital capacity. We've got to start learning the lessons from our failures in digital. And I'm thinking more as implementers and donors here than as software providers, I will say. Because I think we do too much let's do a pilot, let's do another pilot, let's do another pilot. There's never enough really written about what happened. And then you just never know. And when you have to go relearn all the lessons, it's partly why I wrote those blog posts. So I would say we need to do vastly, vastly more. Not only evaluation, but open learning, sharing that learning and aggregating it, turning it into actionable knowledge. So something around that, which I think you could package as let's spend better money, let's get better return on investment. Here is an easy way you can assess the health of your technology projects. In part, we're thinking about trying to offer something like that around the principles themselves, the digital principles, because it is something that donors are asking is how can I understand whether this is a good bet up front, and how can I evaluate how it went afterwards, and can we use the principles for that? So we've got some resources coming out this year on that as well.
Okay. So before we finish up, I'd be curious what types of projects and sectors you've mentioned that Dial has been investing in kind of common digital infrastructure. What are the types of projects in the areas where you're seeing a lot of potential for investment? I noticed that you had written a paper on uses of shared ledgers and Bitcoin. Well, maybe not Bitcoin specifically, but DLT, digital, is it not DLT?
Distributed ledger.
Distributed ledger technology in humanitarian space. I'm curious, is that one of the areas like around payments and finance and shared ledger? Is that one of the areas where you're seeing a lot of interest right now? I
think it's going away a bit because of the impacts on climate that we are learning about in terms of crypto. So that paper was interesting because it came about because donors again were asking, like, should I be taking this stuff seriously with blockchain? What is this about? And so at Gahi, under the leadership of our CEO, Rahul Chandran, we brought together a group of people led by DFID, as it was then, a blockchain advisory group, got a bunch of NGOs together and said, okay, if you're using blockchain, I want to know how and how it's going. In private, we'll do some interviews, you can share some documentation, and we're looking for impact. And if we don't get any information to that effect, then that's what we'll write down. And so we did a really great, actually it wasn't us, it was the Larissa Foss and Julia Coppi did a fantastic paper with the Humanitarian Policy Network about this, or HPG actually, I think it was, Humanitarian Policy Group. And really found that there were uses of blockchain, but that they were primarily on the back end. They were actually even just tiny snippets of relevant code that were being used as a ledger, in no way distributed. And so it wasn't really, there was a lot of hype around using blockchain for accountability and transparency, but really that wasn't happening. Okay. So my suggestion was, look, you could try it. You could try opening up a ledger to show, for example, complaints in humanitarian response. How many are you getting? How many are you clearing up? What are they about? Just that simple stuff across the whole humanitarian response, and open it up so anybody can scrutinize it. And there could be some really interesting analysis done. You people could follow up on these tickets. And so it was just sort of a recommendation around that. I think if, where I see growth, and just to bring it full circle, this is going to turn out to have been a pun, is I think with climate change, we are going to see more and more extreme disasters happening. And we're going to all have to invest much more in disaster preparedness. If you're a humanitarian nerd like me, you'll know that we invest vastly less in preparedness for emergencies than we do in responding, like something in the order of like fractions of a dollar. And we could do better than that. We will probably have to do better than that. I think the reinsurance industry has been pushing us to do that for a long time. When it comes to technology, the reason I was showing that pie chart with, this is the disaster, this is response, this is recovery, and then this is preparedness and risk assessment, that's when technology needs to be deployed, is before. If you're deploying in a crisis, it is too late, especially if you want it to be locally owned and driven, impactful, safe, respectful, responsible. So I think that a growth area is to the use of technology to support local communities to manage their own humanitarian responses more effectively. And really investing in rolling out technologies that could be helpful, maybe things like Frontline, but maybe other things too. There's a lot of fantastic work going on with the unmanned aerial vehicles, drones at the moment, actually, which is fairly open source as well. There's some real opportunities there to involve tech in climate response. And I really hope to see that grow in the preparedness phase.
Okay. So what types of projects are Dial particularly investing in right now? Well, I don't know. Do you consider it investment, or do you consider, like, how does Dial frame granting money to projects? Is it
so we're not grantors, actually. Okay. We're primarily, there's a heady mix of technical assistance and some research and policy influencing, and some building, actually. We've got a catalog of digital solutions, which is also available through the website, digitalimpactalliance.org, includes many open source platforms and products, and helps to make it easier. One of the things we often hear is, well, of course I built a new one. I just couldn't find anything that did what I wanted to do. Well, now you can find it because there's a catalog. So it's really trying to make it easier to reuse and improve technology rather than starting your own. So yeah, it's a mix of doing, thinking, and actually, trying to get other people to pick up what we're doing and take it on. So a primary piece of work is we're working with the government of Sierra Leone on their digital strategy and the rollout of a sort of plan and policy framework around that. We're doing a lot of work around the principles, improving our training resources, including around sustainability, but also how to measure your work against the principles. We've got some fascinating work going on about procurement, largely aimed at procurers within countries. But if you want to get, look at some of the issues around that, we have a leadership brief coming out on the issues in procurement of digital in the coming months. And then, as I said, around, this issue of discoverability and sustainability of digital solutions, and also how to really help turn the corner. So we are building that digital commons of digital global goods that people can build a reusable tech stack, and we can just make the technology better and better and not have to start again. or have things in silos. So
that's awesome.
It's an exciting agenda, and I look forward to seeing it develop.
And is there anything coming up that you would like to mention that you have going on?
Thanks for the reminder. Yes. So also next, so we've got the toolkit that I mentioned on sustainability, and also we will shortly be taping a mini season of the Pulse on the Principles podcast, which is available wherever you get your podcasts, which will deal with these.
Open source,
it's Pulse on the Principles.
Pulse on the Principles.
Yes, that's right. And it's available on all of the top podcast platforms. And the mini season will focus on sustainability, and we'll run through some of the issues in the toolkit in 3 areas. 1, what's your idea? And is that a good idea? 2, how do you build the organization to deliver on that idea? And 3, is that a viable business model? So I've got some fantastic guest speakers, and I'm really looking forward to taping in the next 2 weeks. And then the episodes will air sometime later this year. But thank you for the cross promotion, and I hope some of you will listen in.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah, it's a great topic. So I would like to thank you, Laura, for joining me today. Good luck with the international ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yeah.
Good
luck at the ICRC when you start there next month, and thank you for joining me. This has been brilliant. As I said, I've been kind of admiring your career from afar for a decade now, and I'm glad we got to talk today.
Well, same. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations on the 3rd season.
So this is our first episode. We will be getting this up on YouTube next week. So I will send you a link as soon as we have it. And for all of you watching this on YouTube, next week will be a special episode from, I'll be recording live from the Open Source Summit in Seattle. So we have no topic in particular. I'm going to do a kind of a vox populi of the things that come up during the event with people who are in person in Seattle. So I'm looking forward to that.
That sounds great. Perhaps you'll see some colleads there.
Yeah, I hope so. I usually do run into Mr. Downey, at least in many of these events. So I'm looking forward to it if he's there. Thank you, Laura, for joining me. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Yes, you too.
Goodbye, everybody.